Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang namang sanghang namasami. So I'd like to offer my greetings and welcome everyone this evening. So many years ago, when I was a layman and I was just getting ready to go to Thailand to ordain, to go to Wat Pah Nanachat, um, I was really quite nervous, quite apprehensive, um, excited, but very nervous. Part of it was I'd never done any international travel on my own before. Part of it was I was a very shy person, but a big part of it was I'd heard all these stories about how physically difficult and austere living at Wat Pah Nanachat was. I'd heard all these stories on how you just live alone in a little hut up on stilts in the forest, how you don't have, in that hut, you don't have a bed, you don't have a mattress, you're just sleeping on the floor, or at most just a little plastic mat on the floor. That 3 o'clock every morning, the morning bell goes and everyone's expected to be up. And then after the morning meeting, the morning meditation, everyone has to walk on alms round for a few kilometers barefoot through the village. Then you come back and you only eat one meal for the day. And then in your hut, there's no electricity, and the forest is filled with poisonous snakes and centipedes and scorpions and all kinds of creepy crawlies and swarms of mosquitoes. And there's the tropical heat. And then once a week, everyone has to stay up all night and meditate and stay awake all night long together in the meditation hall. And this sounded, for me, just being someone who is as a city slicker, from the city, a teenager from Canada, it seemed very scary, very intimidating. And when I got to Thailand, I found that all of these things were true, but none of them were nearly as bad as they sound. Um, so, you're in a hut alone in the forest, and it's up on stilts, and it's not scary, it's not intimidating. It kind of feels like your own little treehouse in the forest. You know, um, Not having electricity, you get used to using candles for light. Um, the heat, the tropical heat, you get used to that. The one meal a day, your body changes, your metabolism changes, and it's no problem. You get used to it. Um, the snakes and centipedes and all the poisonous things. Again, it's not so bad. You just learn to watch where you walk, to use a flashlight when you walk. The swarms of mosquitoes. Actually, they weren't that bad. Manitoba mosquitoes are much worse. So it was so all these things, they actually weren't that bad. These things which I thought were going to be bad and scary and intimidating were no problem at all. Um, but what I did find difficult in the beginning and for a while was the solitude, being by yourself. Um, Before I went to Thailand, I was a very active, very energetic, very social person. I was always out doing stuff and, always had some type of stimulation, some type of, watch TV or doing something or listening to music. There was always some kind of stimulation and talking to people. And then all of a sudden going and almost your entire day, you're spending alone with no distractions. There's no TV. There's not even electricity in the huts. There's nothing. And and so this was very difficult. And it's what most people, when they come to uh, Wat Nanachat, find the most difficult. The physical austerities, they sound a lot worse than they actually are. But this being alone, this solitude, it's very difficult. I remember one senior monk, a very senior German monk, came to a monastery I was staying at called Dowdum when I was a novice. And he told us in the beginning you have to just endure being by yourself. But over time you really learn to enjoy being alone, being by yourself. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of real benefits to having solitude, to having this time alone and away from the distractions of the world, because our mind is so trained and it's so habitual for us to, the mind's always going out, always seeking distractions, always going out into the world. So being able to be in a situation where you don't have those, where your mind, you can start bringing your mind in and sending your mind in, and you can really learn a lot about yourself living alone or living in solitude. I remember a number of years ago, I was living in a monastery close to Sydney in Australia, and it was a strange location of the monastery. A couple kilometers up the road, one way, you had a big Hindu retreat center, and then a couple kilometers up the road, the other way, you had a big Catholic monastery. So it was kind of a very monastery area of the country, and one of the monks at the monastery I was staying at was friends with one of the Catholic monks at the Catholic monastery up the road. And he was in his 80s. And he had been a monk for, or lived in the monastery for over 70 years. He went in when he was 11 or 12 years old. And one of the things he was saying was he was hoping, he wished every young person could get a chance to spend a year living alone, because and a year living in silence, because you can learn so much about yourself. So I was during when COVID hit and there was the lockdowns and stuff. I was actually in Thailand and I was living in a hermitage just by myself. And you're really able to learn a lot from those experiences and learn a lot about yourself and really see your mind, see your moods, because there's nothing to stimulate it. There's nothing to um, distract you from it. You can really see, oh, well, this is me. It's not because of these circumstances. This is because of me. And so, um, so saying all this, I know you're probably all thinking, oh, well, that sounds really great, Ajahn Nando, but you're a monk living in a monastery. Of course, it's easy to get solitude, but we're lay people. We have lives, we have jobs. How can we get any, solitude in these circumstances? Um, so a number of years ago, decades and decades ago, I think it was the in the 70s, um, Lumpur Sumedho, who's the most senior Western disciple of Ajahn Chah, he was sent to England with a few other monks to start a monastery. And the first location they had was just this little, like, I think it was like a townhouse or a row house, just right across the street from a pub. So there wasn't a lot of quiet or a lot of solitude going on there, just a few monks in this small place. And then they ended up getting offered some land out in the countryside, and they didn't have any huts or kutis for it yet. And it was just they were all living in this one big old house. It was very dilapidated at the time. They had to do a lot of work to build it back up and fix it up. But Lumpur Sumedho was telling us once that when he went there, he realized he wasn't going to have a lot of physical seclusion or physical solitude there, with them all living together in this one building, in this one house. Um, so he decided to name the monastery Chitta Viveka. So this is now a lot of times it's called Chithurst Monastery, but the actual name of it is Chitta Viveka Forest Monastery. And Chitta Viveka means like the solitude of mind, or like mental solitude. So even though we're not in a situation where we can sometimes get physical solitude, we can work on having some mental solitude and some mental seclusion in these circumstances. And one of the ways we can really do this is by trying to really work on developing our mindfulness and having our continuous mindfulness with us throughout our days. So, mindfulness, a lot of times, this is a real, like, almost like a pop culture word nowadays. It's one you hear all the time in Buddhism. You hear it in a lot of uh, New Age spirituality, or most types of spirituality. You even hear it in a lot of like psychology and pop psychology and stuff. So for mindfulness in Buddhism, when mindfulness, of course, is the English word. There's no direct translation, but mindfulness is the one that we've settled on. Some people use awareness, but in Pali, the word is sati. And Ajahn Jaya describes it really well. He says, sati, it's the ability of the mind to pick up an object, but it's also the ability of the mind to keep that object in mind. So when we are talking about mindfulness, so it's us picking up and being aware of a certain object and keeping that object in our mind. So you hear a lot like, okay, we have to try to be mindful, be mindful throughout your day. Just be mindful. And it's really easier said than done. We have to, a lot of times, we have to learn how to be mindful, how to keep our mindfulness there, and learn little techniques for how to stay mindful, and techniques on how to keep that mindfulness going continuously. So in the Thai forest tradition, the traditional way that is taught by Luang Por Man and Luang Ta Mahabua would be just to mentally chant or recite this word Buddho, Buddho. So just while you're going about things throughout your day, you're just part of your mind has picked up and holding on to this word Buddho. So just again and again in your head, Buddho, Buddho, and this can help ground you, in the present moment, can help stop the mind from just wandering off and getting engaged in all these um, distracted thinking and stuff. But it can be really quite difficult. And I found it really difficult in the beginning. So when I was uh, first entered the monastery, it was what in Thai we call a pakao, which is a layman who wears white and keeps precepts in the monastery. And then when I was a novice, I was reading books by Luang Ta Mahabua and Luang Por Man, and so I tried to do this practice of just doing Buddho all the time. And I'd do it for like 30 seconds, and then I'd lose it and be thinking, and maybe 5 minutes later I realized I lost it. And I get really down and really hard on myself and think, oh, I'm a terrible, terrible novice. I'm never going to make a good monk. Because you'd hear, Luang Por Man, he'd just start doing Buddho and then he'd just never stop. And I wasn't able to do that. And I didn't realize that people like Luang Por Man and Luang Ta Mahabua, these were like the elite of the monks. Like they were really the high end of the monks. They were like, like the Olympic athletes of the monks, or like the Navy SEALs of the monks. And I just wasn't there yet. And so um I had to learn how to develop different techniques for trying to maintain mindfulness throughout the day. And also, I didn't realize at the time, but Luang Por Chah had this really great teaching about mindfulness. He started pouring out some water. And in the beginning, and he was saying mindfulness is like this. So he was pouring out very slowly, gradually. And in the beginning, it's drip, drip, drip. And then as you over time, it becomes drip, 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 drip. And then eventually it gets more and more until it becomes a long stream. He said it's the same with our mindfulness. In the beginning, we're getting these little moments of mindfulness, but as we keep practicing, the moments get more and more and more, and they get longer until eventually our where our practice is good enough, and we're able to keep the mindfulness going. So it's kind of like I think of it kind of like with exercise. There's an exercise called a plank, where you kind of are up on your arms and your feet, and your body is flat but being held up in the air. And if you've never done this before, you do it, and then very quickly you become tired and you can't do it anymore. But if you keep working at it and keep practicing over time, you can hold that plank longer and longer and longer. And so I think of practicing mindfulness is kind of like that. So as we keep practicing it and working on it, we can hold it longer and longer and longer, and it becomes more part of our daily life. So what I found really helpful for trying to maintain mindfulness throughout the day was I'd break the day up into little small segments and small, kind of almost like small little meditations sessions, and find a mindfulness technique to use for each section. So for me, one of the ones I did a lot of, especially if I had to do anything with walking, would be counting. And just so I count my steps. So I'd be like, okay, from walking from my hut to the meditation hall. So in the morning, say I'm going, have to go to the sala, the meditation hall for morning chanting. I'm going to count how many steps I do. And and that would be a mind way to keep my mind. You're aware of the steps, you're aware of the walking, and you're just counting them, and able to keep your mind from just getting into distracted thought and into just staying still with this object, and 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 instead of just being an unlimited just for the amount of day, just for this period, so it makes it a little easier. And one of the things you also see too is you get to the higher and higher numbers, it takes a little more mental energy to stay with that. And it can really also show you a lot about your mind and where your mind is at that day. So some days it's very easy to stay with this your object of mindfulness. It's counting, it's no problem. Other days it's a little bit of a struggle, and some days you're just fighting it. You're just not able to keep it on the object. And so it gives you a little reflection of kind of where your mind is at in the day, because sometimes when we're a little agitated or in a little bit of a grumpy mood, sometimes we're the last to know. Everyone around us is kind of aware of it, but we're not really fully mindful of it yet. So this was a way I did it. Or sometimes, if it's um, you've got something, a particular uh, activity you're going to do, and so you might do something which is preparing you for that. So, for example, in the morning, before going to work or before interacting with someone, you might try doing loving kindness, just while you're, say, walking to work or doing whatever. You might just be reciting those uh, loving kindness chants in your head, just kind of to get you ready for interacting with other people. Which brings us to another one. Another good way to keep mindful is actually just you can just keep a chant going in your mind. And I remember once with a group of monks from Wat Mopjon, we went to go visit Lumpur Suchat, who's this very respected teacher who lives close by there, and he speaks perfect English. And he was telling us that one of the things we can do, he's like, just uh, chant your Patimokkha, which is this long chant that monks do. He's like, just chant that in your head, and it'll keep that your mind from going off. And and this can be a useful way to um, maintain mindfulness. We can also try to work on just being aware of the body, being aware of the posture of the body, the movement of the body. Um, you see some people, you'll see in a lot of times in Mahayana Buddhism, people will be using a mala bead. So it's like a string of beads with, and people will be using that and counting mantras. And that can be really helpful because it gives us something a little more tactile to help you with that. But sometimes you can't use something like that. So sometimes even just doing a little physical tactile thing. So just maybe moving your thumb back and forth across your finger, can give a little more something to help keep the mind with that, because it's a little more tactile. It's a little more um, easier for our mind to absorb in it. There's actually a monk, he's died now, but he was quite well known in Thailand. And that was one of the ways. He taught many ways, but that was one of the ways he would teach to be mindful, just doing something little like that. So, or we could do some type of just recollection as we're going about the day. So as we go about the day, um, and we're able to be mindful and keep this mindfulness going, it kind of keeps us, it'll keep our mind from proliferating, it'll keep our mind from going out, and it kind of lets us step back a bit from what we're doing. So again, I think of it as a little like the difference between, sitting back and watching a soap opera versus actually being in the soap opera. So it brings us back from the world and these, what's going on. And so one of the things that Buddha was saying that, a lot of times with, like, say, with the eyes, through any of the senses, but through the eyes, you see something and your mind is grasping at its signs and features. So, say you see a house, and you start thinking, oh, you don't just see the house, you see the house and then you start thinking, oh, that's really nice. Oh, actually, that's not. I would change this. And you start, getting attached to those things. And so if you have good mindfulness, you can step back and not get so drawn in. But it's also good to be very careful of our activities when we're being mindful. So if, say, we're trying to be mindful on Budo and just the recitation of Budo, when we're doing something like driving, we want to be careful of that. We actually want to have all of our mindfulness in the driving so we don't get into an accident. Lumpur Cha, and that's another factor which is added with mindfulness. We call it sampajanya, or clear comprehension, which is a bit more of like an all-around knowing. So Lumpur Cha used to tell this story. There was this monk who used to come and visit Wat Pah Pong, but he was senior to Lumpur Cha. And so on the Bindabat routes, he would, the morning alms round, he would always go first because the order we walk in is in the order of who ordained first. And so our seniority is all based on who ordained first, not by who's studied more, or whose meditation is better, or who gives better Dhamma talks. It's all based on just when we ordain. And so this monk would go before Ajahn Chah, even though it was Ajahn Chah's monastery. And this monk really prided himself with how mindful he was and how mindful he was in his body. But he didn't have any sampajanya. He didn't have any clear comprehension, any all around knowing. So he'd be very mindful, but he wouldn't be paying attention to where he was walking. So he'd walk off into the rice fields, or he'd walk off into a buffalo pen or something like this instead of walking down the road. So we want to avoid that when we're practicing. So when we do are able to have mindfulness in our lives, it does give us a bit more of this mental or solitude or seclusion of mind from what's going around in the world. So I'd like to offer that as a bit of a reflection for everyone this evening.